The last guests were gone. Petals from the afternoon ceremony clung to the stone path, and the chairs sat empty beneath the live oaks. Scott Collier stood at the garden arch, tightening a bracket that had worked itself loose during the reception. His hands moved without hurry. Julia Trent stood 30 feet away, near the edge of the terrace. She had not planned to stay this long. Scott glanced over his shoulder. She was still there, framed by the arch behind her and the Ashley River beyond. He set his wrench on the railing. "You'd make a great bride," he said. She smiled. "I would need a groom for that." Neither of them moved. The string lights clicked on above the arch, the timer Scott had set himself, and the garden filled with a low, warm glow. She looked up at the lights, then back at him. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the shed. She stayed at the arch. This story begins long before that evening, and what Whitfield Estate is hiding has nothing to do with weddings. Stay for this one. Scott Collier woke at 5:15 every morning, same as he had for 2 years. He dressed in the dark, poured coffee into a steel thermos, and drove his truck 11 minutes to the front gate of Whitfield Estate. By 5:40, he was on the grounds. The estate sat on 14 acres along the Ashley River, just south of the old city limits of Charleston, South Carolina. A live oak canopy lined the main drive, the branches arching overhead and nearly touching. A stone terrace ran the full length of the main building, overlooking the river. 2 gardens east and west flanked a central pavilion, connected by a crushed shell path that curved through boxwood hedges and beds of Confederate jasmine. A wooden pergola anchored the west garden. On weekends, the property hosted 2 or 3 weddings. On weekdays, it was quiet. Just the birds, the river, and Scott. He walked the grounds before anyone else arrived. He checked the irrigation valves in the east garden, tested the drainage grates along the terrace edge, and inspected the timber joints on the pergola where humidity warped the framing every spring. He moved through the property the way a man moves through his own house without hesitation, without consulting a map. He knew which gate hinge would stiffen in cold weather and which retaining wall shifted a 1/4 inch every January when the soil froze. At 7:30, he drove to Pinckney Elementary. His son Max climbed into the passenger seat with a backpack and a paperback tucked under his arm. Max was 9. He had his mother's quiet way of watching things before deciding whether to speak. Most mornings, they rode in comfortable silence, Max reading, Scott drinking from his thermos, the radio off. That Tuesday morning, Max looked up from his book. "Any weddings this weekend?" 3, Scott said. Max nodded and went back to reading. Scott turned onto the school road and pulled to the front entrance. Max pushed the door open, swung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked toward the double doors without looking back. Scott waited until the boy disappeared inside, then drove back to the estate. By 9, staff cars were pulling into the gravel lot behind the main building. Jean Willard arrived at 8:50, same as she had for 21 years. Jean was 62 and ran the event coordination office with a system of color-coded binders and handwritten ledgers that no one else fully understood. She had worked under Harold Whitfield, the original owner, and she had stayed on when Trent Properties acquired the estate in 2023, 6 months after Harold died. Jean stayed because the property needed someone who remembered how it was supposed to work. Julia Trent arrived at 10. She was 35 and had been the CEO of Trent Properties for 2 years, since her father retired. He had built the company from a single rental property in Raleigh. Julia had grown the portfolio from 11 properties to 19. She managed from the corporate office in Charlotte spreadsheets, quarterly calls, portfolio reviews. She rarely visited. This was her first in-person visit to Whitfield since the acquisition. Greg Linden met her at the front entrance. Greg was 53, the estate's general manager for 16 years, and he greeted Julia with the polished ease of a man who had spent 2 decades hosting other people's most important days. He walked Julia through the venue occupancy rates, terrace bookings, vendor relationships. Bookings were up 12%. The terrace was in highest demand it had ever seen. Greg presented every number with the confidence of a man who believed no one would check. As they crossed the east garden path, Julia noticed a man kneeling beside a retaining wall, resetting a capstone that had shifted. His hands were steady and deliberate, and he did not look up as they passed. "Who's that?" Julia asked. Greg barely glanced. "Groundskeeper. Been here about 2 years. Keeps to himself." They moved on. Julia filed the image and kept walking. Later that afternoon, Jean stopped by the office where Julia was reviewing capital expenditure files. They talked, scheduling, staffing, the fall wedding calendar. As Jean gathered her binders to leave, she mentioned it almost as an aside, a thought she had carried for a while and finally set down. "That groundskeeper Scott, he knows this property better than anyone I've ever worked with." She paused at the door. "Walks the grounds like he built them." Julia looked up from the file. Jean was already gone. The next morning, Julia sat in the document room on the second floor, reviewing Greg's renovation proposal for the East Garden. The number on the cover page was $420,000. The scope called for modernizing the drainage system, expanding guest capacity by 30%, and replacing the existing stone path with poured concrete. Greg had framed the project as overdue infrastructure, a necessary investment to maintain the estate's competitive position in the Charleston wedding market. Julia was not the kind of executive who approved numbers without understanding what she was paying for. If she was going to sign off on nearly $500,000, she needed to know what had been built in the first place. She asked Jean to pull the original architectural archive. Jean returned 20 minutes later with a cardboard tube from the filing cabinet in the basement, a set of rolled blueprints from 2017, stamped by Alderman and Kirk, a hospitality architecture firm based in Atlanta. The drawings were precise and layered site plans, drainage schematics, structural details for the pavilion and pergola, landscape grading for the east and west gardens, irrigation routing for every zone on the property. Julia unrolled the first sheet across the document room table and pinned the corners with coffee cups. In the lower right corner, inside the title block, the lead architect's name was printed in clean block letters. Scott A. Collier, Aya. She stopped. She read it again. She walked to the window and looked down. On the east terrace, 2 stories below, Scott Collier was pressure washing the stone surface, moving the wand in even, overlapping rows. The same man who had been on his knees resetting capstones the day before. The same man who walked the grounds every morning before dawn, like he knew where every wire and pipe ran beneath the soil. Julia returned to the table and opened her laptop. She searched Alderman and Kirk's public project portfolio. Scott A. Collier Senior Project Architect, 2014 to 2022. 4 major hospitality properties across the Southeast, a resort in Savannah, a conference center in Greenville, a hotel renovation in Beaufort, and Whitfield Estate. Whitfield was his signature project. It had been featured in Architectural Digest in 2018. The article included photographs of the terrace, the pavilion, and the East Garden, the same views Julia had walked past that morning without knowing whose hand had drawn them into existence. The writer described Whitfield Estate as one of the finest private event venues on the eastern seaboard. Julia closed the laptop slowly. She sat with the information for a long time. The blueprints lay open on the table in front of her, his name repeated on every sheet site plan. Structural, electrical, plumbing, landscape. Every system on the 14 acres below her had passed through his hands before a single shovel broke ground. She did not go downstairs. She did not call Greg. She did not walk out to the terrace and ask Scott Collier why the man who had designed this estate was now pressure washing its stones. When Jean came back to collect the binders, Julia asked one question. "How long has Scott been here?" Jean thought about it. "Since about 6 months before you acquired. Harold hired him directly." Julia nodded. After Jean left, she walked the East Garden alone. She knelt beside the drainage grate Scott had checked the previous morning, part of the system he had designed 8 years ago. The system Greg Linden was now requesting $420,000 to tear out and replace. She ran her fingers along the grate's edge. The metalwork was clean, the channel beneath it clear. Water moved through it exactly as it was designed to. But what Julia Trent discovered in that title block was only the beginning. What Whitfield Estate was actually hiding would take longer to surface, and it had nothing to do with drainage. Julia extended her visit. She told Greg she wanted 2 additional days on site to review all pending capital proposals before approving anything from Charlotte. Greg nodded, accommodating as always. He offered to arrange a second walkthrough with the operations staff. Julia declined. She said she wanted someone who knew the grounds, the physical grounds, not the spreadsheets, to walk her through the property system by system. She asked for the groundskeeper. Greg hesitated for half a second. Then he arranged it. Scott walked Julia through the estate that afternoon. They started at the east garden and moved west. She asked about the irrigation routing. He explained the dual-zone layout, one pressure system for the ornamental gardens, a separate lower pressure system for the lawn terraces, and how the regulators at each junction prevented the jasmine beds from flooding during heavy spring rain. She asked about the retaining walls along the south perimeter. He described the footing depth 32 inches below grade, the drainage aggregate packed behind each wall, and the expansion joints spaced every 16 feet to accommodate seasonal ground movement. He spoke the way engineers speak: load paths, pressure differentials, material specifications. Twice, he caught himself used a term that belonged in a design review, not a groundskeeper's vocabulary, and shifted to something simpler. Julia watched him correct course each time. She did not press. She absorbed it. Greg appeared at the edge of the terrace during their second loop through the west garden. He stood with his hands in his pockets, watching them from 40 yards away, the CEO and the groundskeeper, walking shoulder to shoulder along the path he had managed for 16 years, having a conversation he was not part of. He did not approach, but his posture shifted. His weight moved forward slightly, like a man deciding whether to cross a room. Later that afternoon, he found Jean in the coordination office. "What are they discussing out there?" he asked. "The property," Jean said, not looking up from her binder. Greg waited for more. None came. He adjusted his cuffs and left. From that point on, he began showing up wherever Julia was, on the grounds, standing at the edge of conversations, offering context she had not requested, answering questions she had directed at Scott. He positioned himself between them with the practiced ease of a man who had been controlling the flow of information at Whitfield for 16 years and was not accustomed to someone else holding it. That evening, Julia found Scott near the equipment shed, cleaning the pressure washer he had used that morning. She asked about the East Garden proposal. She kept her voice neutral. $420,000 for drainage and capacity. What do you think? Scott wiped his hands on a shop rag. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. Then, carefully, "The drainage is fine. I designed it to handle twice the current load." He stopped. The sentence sat between them. He had said it before he could pull it back. Julia's expression did not change. She thanked him for the walk and returned to the office. The following day, Scott took Julia through the west garden. They moved slowly. He showed her how the crushed shell path had been graded to shed water toward a concealed channel that ran beneath the boxwood hedge, a detail invisible from the surface, but critical to keeping the root systems from drowning in wet seasons. He pointed out where a plumbing subcontractor had run PVC pipe where the original specifications called for copper, and where the irrigation controller in the west zone had been downgraded from the programmable unit in the original design to a basic mechanical timer that could not adjust for rainfall. At the base of the main pavilion, where the poured foundation met the ground, he stopped. He knelt and brushed dirt and moss away from a cornerstone. Cut into the surface, shallow but legible, the kind of mark that could survive a century if the stone held were 3 letters and a year. Sac, 2017. Julia crouched beside him. "What's that?" "Architect's mark," Scott said. He kept his eyes on the stone. "The man who designed the building left his initials. He did not say I. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans, and kept walking. Julia stayed low for a moment. She traced the letters with her finger, the S, the A, the C, then stood and followed him. Their interactions shifted after that afternoon. The dynamic between them changed in a way that neither of them named but both understood. Julia stopped framing her questions as a CEO conducting a property review. She asked Scott's judgment directly where the drainage genuinely needed attention and where it was fine, which structures could handle additional event loading and which were already at capacity, whether the terrace reinforcement Greg had proposed made any engineering sense at all. She walked beside him differently now. Not as an executive touring a property, but as someone who trusted the person next to her. She listened to his answers the way she would listen to a senior consultant, with weight, without argument, with the quiet understanding that the person speaking knew more than she did about this subject and probably always would. Scott noticed the change. He did not comment on it, but he stopped correcting his vocabulary mid-sentence. He stopped downshifting from architect to groundskeeper when she was around. She had seen his name on the blueprints. She had traced his initials on the foundation stone. There was nothing left to simplify. That same week, Greg submitted a second capital proposal. $380,000 for structural reinforcement of the main terrace. He attached a report from a contractor in Mount Pleasant, recommending immediate intervention. Scott reviewed the drawings at Julia's request that evening, in the document room where the original blueprints were still spread across the table. The terrace had been designed with reinforced concrete over a steel support frame, with rebar spacing and concrete mix specifications he had calculated for a 60-year service life under continuous event loading. The slab showed no cracking, no settling, no deflection. It did not need structural reinforcement for at least another 3 decades. Julia now had 2 proposals from Greg Linden, totaling $800,000, both for work the property did not need. 2 proposals that, if approved from Charlotte without an on-site review, would have sent $800,000 into renovations that solved problems that did not exist. She asked Jean to pull every capital expenditure filing since 2020. Julia asked Scott to walk the entire property one more time. Not a tour, not a review. A structural audit every building, every system, every path and retaining wall and drainage line on 14 acres. Scott agreed. They started at dawn, before the staff arrived, and worked east to west over 4 hours. The grounds were empty. Dew sat heavy on the jasmine, and the river fog had not yet burned off the terrace. He spoke without restraint for the first time. Load calculations, soil composition, material specifications, joint tolerances, concrete compression ratings, timber grading. He pointed out where the pergola's framing timber had been replaced with a cheaper species than what he had specified, southern yellow pine instead of white oak, and where the replacement had already begun to warp in the tender humidity. He showed her where a retaining wall footer had been poured 4 inches shallow of specification, creating a lean that would worsen with each freeze-thaw cycle. He walked her along the south drainage channel and showed her where a maintenance crew had capped a cleanout port that should have remained accessible, a shortcut that would cause a backup within 2 seasons. He identified every deviation between what he had designed and what now existed on the grounds, and Julia wrote each one down without comment. By the time they reached the pavilion, the fog had lifted and the first event staff cars were pulling into the lot. Julia stopped walking. She looked at the foundation stone. SAC, 2017. Scott A. Collier, she said. Halderman and Kirk, lead architect, 2017. Scott stood very still. His hands hung at his sides. The wrench in his back pocket caught the morning light. I found your name on the blueprints 4 days ago, Julia said. Every sheet, site plan, structural, electrical, landscape, all of them. The silence lasted a long time. A mockingbird called from the live oak above them. The river moved behind the terrace, slow and tidal. Neither of them stepped back. Neither of them looked away. Laura died in 2022. Scott said finally. His voice was steady but deliberate, each word placed carefully. I took leave from the firm, extended. I kept saying I would go back. Then they restructured. My position was eliminated. I didn't fight it. He looked at the pavilion, the building he had drawn, engineered, and watched rise from a bare foundation on this exact ground. I needed work. I knew this property better than any property I had ever touched. Every footing, every wire, every pipe. Harold hired me without asking questions. Maintaining what I built, that was the only thing that still made sense. Julia did not offer sympathy. She did not soften her posture or change her tone. She treated what he said the way she treated every piece of information that mattered. She absorbed it, placed it in context, and moved forward. Greg submitted 2 proposals totaling $800,000, she said. Both for work this property does not need. You know that better than anyone alive. I know, Scott said. Will you help me understand what's real and what isn't? Yes. That same evening, Julia's phone rang at 8:45. It was Jean. A bride from a wedding 3 weeks earlier had called the estate that afternoon, asking about the final invoice for her premium terrace package. Jean had checked the internal booking system, the corporate system Greg maintained and reported to Charlotte. The wedding was logged as a standard garden package, a tier that cost roughly half of what the bride described paying. Jean's voice was measured on the phone, but Julia could hear the precision beneath it, the voice of a woman who had spent 21 years keeping records and knew exactly what a discrepancy meant. Jean had already pulled 5 additional files from her own coordination binders. The pattern held in every one. Julia told Jean to keep pulling. Every event, every file, going back as far as her records reached. Jean arrived at the estate office at 7 the next morning with a 3-ring binder 2 inches thick, tabbed by month and year. Her own records, kept independently of the corporate system Greg managed, cross-referenced against client contracts she had filed copies of for 21 years. The numbers did not match. 147 weddings, over 3 years from mid-2020 through 2023. Couples had been billed for premium packages. Terrace ceremonies with imported stone table settings, custom floral arches bolted into the pergola structure, upgraded commercial lighting rigs, dedicated coordination staff. The rates ranged from $15,000 to $25,000, depending on the package tier. The same events appeared in the Trent Properties corporate booking system as standard packages, folding chairs on the lawn, potted arrangements along the path, basic string lighting, billed at $8,000 to $12,000. The difference, roughly $7,000 to $13,000 per event, had been routed through a company called Linden Events, LLC. Jean had looked up the state registration, filed under Greg Linden's home address in Mount Pleasant, his wife listed as the registered agent. Jean spread the ledger pages across the desk. She had organized the discrepancies chronologically, with the client-facing contract on the left side of each page and the corporate booking record on the right. 147 events, 3 years. The estimated total diversion, $1.1 million. Scott sat across the table. Julia had asked him to be there. He confirmed the physical evidence, and his confirmation carried a weight that no accountants could. The premium setups he had observed over 2 years of maintaining the property did not match standard package specifications. Commercial lighting rigs, rated for outdoor concert installation, bolted into junction boxes he had never specified. Italian travertine overlay panels laid across the terrace for high-end receptions material that cost 4 times what the standard stone surface beneath it already provided. Structural floral frameworks welded to steel brackets and bolted directly into the pergola's framing members, leaving holes in the white oak that would need to be filled and sealed after every event. None of that was standard. He knew because he had written the original package tier descriptions with Harold Whitfield in 2017, sitting at the same table where they now sat. Standard meant string lights on shepherd hooks, potted seasonal arrangements along the shell path, and folding chairs on the east lawn. What Greg had been delivering to clients was premium, What Greg had been reporting to Charlotte was standard, and the gap between the two, $7,000 to $13,000 per wedding, had been flowing into his own company for 3 years. Julia now had 2 layers. The inflated capital proposal's $800,000 for renovation work the property did not need, and the event revenue diversion, $1.1 million, funneled through Linden Events, LLC. Nearly $2 million total. Julia called Trent Properties legal counsel in Charlotte that night. She gave them the binder, the booking discrepancies, the LLC registration, and the capital proposal analysis Scott had provided. She asked them to send a forensic accounting team with subpoena authority for the estate's banking records. She did not tell Greg. She did not change her schedule. She arrived the next morning at the same time and walked the grounds at the same pace. Greg noticed nothing different. Later that evening, she found Scott on the terrace. The chairs from that morning's setup were still out, arranged in the curved rows for a Saturday wedding. The river was black and still beyond the railing. Julia sat in the chair beside his without asking. "Did Harold ever suspect?" she asked. Scott shook his head slowly. Harold trusted Greg completely. 20 years together. He never questioned a number Greg put in front of him. It never occurred to him that he needed to. And after Harold died, there was no one watching, Scott said. Greg got bolder because the owner who had hired him was gone, and the new owner managed from 200 miles away. Julia was quiet for a while. The river moved. A boat light passed in the distance, slow and steady. The chairs around them sat empty, waiting for the weekend's guests. "I wasn't here," she said. Scott did not respond. He did not need to. The forensic team arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 accountants from Trent Properties outside counsel in Charlotte, carrying laptops and a banking subpoena for the estate's operating accounts. They set up in the second-floor document room, cleared the blueprints from the table, and spent 3 days working through the financial records. On Monday morning, Julia asked Greg to come to the estate office at 10. The forensic accountant sat on one side of the table. Julia sat at the head. Scott was not in the room. Jean was not in the room. This was between the CEO and her general manager. Julia laid out the evidence in order. The booking discrepancies, 147 events where the client-facing contract showed a premium package and the corporate system showed standard. The Linden Events LLC registration filed to Greg's home address, his wife as registered agent. The money trail. Then she laid out the capital proposals. $800,000 in renovation work for systems that did not need repair. Drainage designed for twice the current load. A terrace engineered for a 60-year service life. Lighting infrastructure installed 5 years ago that exceeded current code requirements. Greg sat very still. He did not interrupt. When Julia finished, he adjusted his posture and spoke in the same polished tone he had used on her first day, the voice of a man accustomed to being believed. He said Linden Events was a supplementary coordination service. Premium weddings required outside management capacity that the estate's small staff could not handle. He said the revenue routing was standard practice for overflow vendors in the hospitality industry. He said the capital proposals were based on manufacturer-recommended maintenance cycles, not on any assessment of the existing system's condition. The lead forensic accountant opened a folder. The transfers from the estate's operating account went directly to Linden Events LLC, not from client payments. From the operating account Greg controlled, the money never touched a client invoice. It moved from Trent Properties' account to Greg Linden's company, coded as vendor payments for coordination services that had no contracts, no deliverables, and no staffing records. Greg stopped talking. His hands, which had been folded on the table when he sat down, now gripped the chair's armrests. The room was quiet, except for the sound of the forensic accountant closing the folder. Julia terminated him that afternoon. She did it in 4 sentences. There was no negotiation, no severance discussion, no exit interview. 16 years of polished ease and controlled information, and it ended in a room where the numbers finally spoke louder than the man who had hidden them. Security walked him to his car with a single box from his office, a framed photo, a coffee mug, and a desk clock that had been a gift from Harold Whitfield on his 10th anniversary. Julia referred the matter to the Charleston County District Attorney. Fraud, embezzlement, breach of fiduciary duty. The forensic team preserved the financial records and transferred certified copies to law enforcement. Jean Willard was named interim operations manager that same afternoon. She accepted with a single nod, picked up her binder, and walked back to the coordination office as if she had been waiting for someone to ask. Scott was in the East Garden when Julia walked out of the main building. She crossed the terrace and stood beside him near the retaining wall where she had first noticed him on the second day of a visit that was supposed to last 2. She did not say what had happened inside. He did not ask. The information existed between them without needing to be spoken. They had built the case together. The conclusion did not require narration. They stood in the late afternoon, looking at the grounds. The jasmine was blooming heavy along the south wall, the scent carried by a warm breeze off the river. The irrigation system clicked on behind them, his irrigation system running through its evening cycle on the timer he had set 2 years ago. A week passed. Julia did not return to Charlotte. She worked from the second-floor office, managing Trent Properties remotely while overseeing the transition at Whitfield. New vendor contracts, updated booking systems with direct corporate visibility, a full audit of every capital expenditure Greg had approved in the past 5 years. She was on the phone with Charlotte 4 hours a day and on the grounds the other 8. On a Wednesday afternoon, she asked Scott to come upstairs. He stood by the window in the second-floor office, his work boots leaving faint dirt marks on the hardwood. Julia sat at the desk. She offered him a new role, Director of Property and Design, Whitfield Estate. Full authority over renovation planning, maintenance oversight, capital budgeting, and long-term property development. Salaried. Benefits. A title that matched what he had been doing unofficially since the day she arrived. Scott looked out the window at the grounds, the East Garden, the terrace, the pavilion with his initials cut into its foundation stone 20 feet below where they stood. "I don't know," he said. Julia waited. She did not fill the silence. "The groundskeeper job was something I could do without." He stopped. He tried again. "After Laura, I couldn't be the person who designed things. I could only be the person who maintained them. There's a difference. Designing means you're building something new. Maintaining means you're holding on to what's already there." He put his hand against the window frame. "This place was the only thing I could still take care of without it costing me something I didn't have left to give." Julia's hands rested flat on the desk. "I know there's a difference," she said. "I'm not asking you to be someone you're not. I'm asking you to be recognized for who you already are." She told him the offer would stand as long as he needed. There was no deadline. There was no pressure. She simply placed it on the table between them and left it there. Scott did not answer that day. That evening, after the staff had gone home and the gravel lot sat empty, Scott walked the grounds alone. The sun was low over the river, and the live oak shadows stretched long across the East Garden. He stopped at the pavilion and put his hand on the cornerstone SAC, 2017. The letters were cool under his palm. He had carved them with a masonry chisel on the last day of construction, after the final inspection, after the crew had packed up and the site was quiet. He walked to the pergola and ran his fingers along the joints he had been checking every morning for 2 years. He followed the crushed shell path to the West Garden, past the jasmine wall, past the irrigation controller he had specified. He stood at the garden arch, where the string lights clicked on at their usual time and lit the empty chairs beneath the oaks. He had built all of this, every line, every angle, every system beneath the soil, and for 2 years he had tended it in silence, mowing, repairing, adjusting, protecting, asking nothing in return except the right to stay close to the work that was still, in every way that mattered, his. The question Julia had asked was not whether he could do the job. He had been doing the job since the day Harold hired him. The question was whether he was ready to carry his own name again. He called Julia the next morning at 6:15, She answered on the second ring. "I'll take the title," he said. "But I'm still walking the grounds at 5:40. But before Scott Collier could step into the role he had earned, Whitfield Estate had one more season to get through, and this time, someone would be watching. 3 weeks later, Scott sat at the desk Greg Linden had occupied for 16 years. The office looked different now. Jean had cleared out Greg's files, and the walls held the original Alderman and Kirk elevation drawings that Julia had framed from the blueprint archive. Scott's own work, hanging in his own office, in the building he had designed. He was reviewing the first honest renovation proposal the estate had received in 5 years. A real one, repointing the south terrace wall, where 2 winters of moisture had loosened the mortar joints, and replacing the pergola's warped yellow pine with the white oak species he had originally specified. Total cost, $61,000. The work the property actually needed. Max started coming to the estate after school. Jean set him up with a chair, a reading lamp, and a corner of the event coordination office where he could do his homework and look out the window at the grounds. He liked the quiet rhythm of the building, the phones, Jean's voice scheduling vendors, the occasional sound of his father's boots crossing the terrace below. Julia was still in Charleston. She had extended her stay 3 times. Her laptop sat open on the second-floor desk each morning, Charlotte conference calls playing in the background while she walked the property with Jean or reviewed contracts downstairs. She had not announced a departure date. No one had asked for one. One afternoon in early March, Max finished his math worksheet and wandered out to the terrace. Julia was sitting in one of the wrought iron chairs, reading a property assessment on her tablet. The river moved behind her, flat and silver in the late light. Max stood a few feet away, his backpack still over one shoulder. "Are you the boss?" he asked. Julia looked up. "I suppose I am. My dad fixes everything here," Max said. Julia set the tablet down. "I know he does." Max considered this. Then he sat in the chair beside her, let his backpack slide to the ground, and looked at the river. They were quiet together for a while, not awkwardly, but with the easy comfort of 2 people who did not need to perform for each other. "Dad says 3 weddings this weekend," Max said. "That sounds about right," Julia said. When Scott came looking for Max 20 minutes later, he found them in the garden shed. Max had led Julia to the tool wall, every wrench, socket, clamp, and driver organized on pegboard hooks in the system Scott had designed, each position labeled by function and size on strips of masking tape in Scott's handwriting. Max was explaining the system with the same quiet seriousness he brought to everything. Julia was listening the way she always listened, completely, without performing, without checking her phone, without the half-attention that most adults gave a 9-year-old's explanation of a tool wall. Scott leaned against the doorframe. He watched. He did not interrupt. That evening, after Max was in bed in the apartment they rented 6 miles from the estate, Julia called. "I'm restructuring oversight for every Trent property," she said. "Quarterly site visits, direct operational review. Every site, every quarter. No more managing from spreadsheets in Charlotte." "Starting with which one?" Scott asked. There was a pause. He could hear the river through her open window. She was still at the estate, still in the second-floor office, still in Charleston. "Starting with this one," Julia said. 2 months later, the first warm days of spring settled over Charleston like a slow exhale. Whitfield Estate looked different, not redesigned, restored. The pergola stood in white oak again, the grain tight and pale, the joints cut to the tolerances Scott had drawn in his original specifications 8 years ago. The south terrace wall had been repointed with lime mortar that matched the original mix. The east garden drainage ran clean through the channels he had graded and lined before the first shovel of topsoil was ever placed. The jasmine along the south wall had been pruned back to the framework he had planted, and new growth was already climbing the wire supports, fragrant in the warm air. The first wedding under new management was scheduled for a Saturday in late March. Jean had coordinated every detail, the real package, at the real price, recorded in the real system, visible to Charlotte in real time. 200 guests, terrace ceremony. Reception under the pavilion. Everything documented, everything accurate, everything as it should have been all along. Max helped set chairs in the east garden that morning. He liked the geometry of the layout, the rows curving to follow the garden arch, each chair angled 2 degrees from the last, so every seat had a clear sight line to where the couple would stand. Scott had shown him the spacing once. Max carried 2 chairs at a time across the lawn and placed them with careful precision, checking the gap between each pair with his arm span the way his father checked joints with a level. Julia arrived at noon. She walked the grounds with Jean, reviewed the final setup, confirmed the schedule with the caterer and the florist. She stood on the terrace and looked at the property, every stone, every timber, every system running the way it had been designed to run, maintained by the man who had designed it, managed by a company that was finally paying attention. The ceremony began at 4. Scott and Julia stood at the back, near the catering entrance, side by side. They did not speak during the vows. They did not need to. The bride and groom stood under the garden arch Scott had built, in the east garden he had designed, surrounded by 200 guests who did not know that the man at the back of the ceremony was the reason any of it existed. After the last cars pulled down the oak-lined drive and the taillights disappeared, Scott walked the grounds for breakdown. He checked the arch brackets, the chair rows, the lighting connections, the terrace drainage. The same routine he had followed after every wedding for 2 years, except now the clipboard in his hand carried a director's authority, and the woman walking beside him owned the property. Julia did not help with the breakdown. She was not there to work. She was there to walk beside him. They reached the garden arch. Petals scattered on the stone path, ribbons loose on the railing, chairs empty beneath the live oaks. The string lights clicked on. Same timer, same moment. The garden filled with that low, warm glow, the same glow that had lit her face 2 months ago, the evening he had said the words that neither of them had forgotten. Julia looked at the arch. Then she looked at him. Scott did not repeat the joke. He did not need to. Everything that had brought them here, the blueprints, the drainage grates, the foundation stone, the fraud, the mornings at 5:40, the toolbox, the terrace where she had stood watching him work before she knew who he was, all of it had led back to this arch, the place where other people stood and made promises. He reached for her hand. She took it. Her fingers closed around his, and neither of them let go. They stood under the arch he had built, at the venue he had designed, in the place where he had chosen to stay when everything else had fallen away. At the far edge of the garden, Max sat on the stone bench beneath the oldest live oak on the property. He had come outside without being called. He saw them standing together under the lights, his father and this woman who listened the way his mother used to listen, completely and without pretending. Max did not call out. He opened his book, turned to his page, and read in the glow. He had built this place for other people's ceremonies. He hadn't known he was building his own.